What happens when a mother's cruelty backfires in the most unexpected way? When love blooms in the darkest corners of oppression? This is a story that will shake you to your core. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories that will leave you speechless. The Georgia sun beat mercilessly down on Willowbrook Plantation in the summer of 1858, its rays casting long shadows across the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The grand white mansion stood like a monument to power and privilege, its towering columns and wraparound porches a stark contrast to the humble slave quarters that dotted the landscape beyond. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like ghostly curtains, swaying gently in the humid breeze that carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and the distant sound of field songs, melancholy melodies that spoke of endurance and hidden hope. Inside the opulent parlor, Marjorie Lorne sat rigidly in her high-backed chair, her steel-grey eyes fixed on the ledger before her. At 45, she was a woman carved from stone and determination, her once beautiful features hardened by years of wielding absolute authority over her domain. The black mourning dress she still wore, 3 years after her husband's death, seemed to absorb the light around her, making her appear as a dark spectre presiding over her empire. Her fingers, adorned with rings that had belonged to 3 generations of Lorne women, traced the columns of numbers that represented human lives reduced to monetary value. The parlor itself was a testament to Southern wealth and refinement, crystal chandeliers imported from France, Persian rugs that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch over their descendant with approval. But beneath the veneer of civilization lay the brutal foundation upon which it all rested, the labor of enslaved human beings who had built this grandeur with their blood, sweat, and tears. "Mrs. Lorne," came the hesitant voice of Samuel, her overseer, as he knocked on the parlor door. His weathered hands clutched his hat nervously, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead, despite the relative coolness of the house. "Enter," she commanded, not bothering to look up from her calculations. The numbers told a story of profit and loss, of human beings bought and sold like livestock, of a system that had made her family wealthy beyond measure. Samuel stepped inside, his weathered face bearing the permanent squint of a man who'd spent decades under the southern sun. He'd been with the Lorne family for 15 years, rising from a poor white overseer to a trusted manager, but he still felt the familiar nervousness that came with reporting to the formidable widow. 15 strong ones, ma'am, all young, all healthy. The trader says they'll fetch good work in the fields. Cost us $1,200 for the lot, but they should pay for themselves within 2 seasons. Marjorie finally raised her eyes, and Samuel felt the familiar chill that came with her direct gaze. Those grey eyes had seen everything: slave auctions where families were torn apart, punishments that would haunt a man's dreams, the casual cruelty that was necessary to maintain order in their world. "And my son? Where is Thomas?" "In his room, ma'am, reading again." Samuel's voice carried a note of disapproval that he tried to hide. Like most men of his class, he believed that a plantation owner's son should be learning the practical skills of management and control, not losing himself in books and poetry. The woman's jaw tightened, and her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the ledger. Thomas, her 22-year-old son, who should have been the pride of the plantation, the heir to carry on the Lorne legacy. Instead, he was a constant source of shame and frustration, delicate where he should be strong, gentle where he should be firm, and worst of all, harboring inclinations that made her stomach turn with disgust. She'd caught him more than once looking at the male house servants, with an expression that made her blood run cold. The very thought of it made her feel as though the family name was being dragged through the mud. "Fetch him," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "It's time he learned what it means to be a man." Samuel hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd seen what happened when Marjorie decided to teach lessons, and it rarely ended well for anyone involved. "Ma'am, perhaps—" "Did I stutter, Samuel?" Her voice cut through the air like a whip crack, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "No, ma'am. Right away." Samuel backed toward the door, grateful to escape the intensity of her gaze. As Samuel's footsteps faded down the hallway, Marjorie rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the slave quarters. The view from here encompassed her entire domain, hundreds of acres of cotton fields, the gin house where the crop was processed, the stables, the workshops, and the rows of simple cabins where her human property lived. She could see the new arrivals being processed, 15 souls reduced to property, their lives now bound to her will. Among them she noticed one who stood differently from the others, taller with broader shoulders, and a bearing that suggested he hadn't yet been broken by the system that now owned him. His posture was too straight, his gaze too direct. That would need to be corrected. Perfect, she thought, her lips curving into a cold smile. He'll do nicely for what I have in mind. The plan that was forming in her mind was born of desperation and fury. For years, she'd watched her son grow into everything she despised. Weak, sensitive, more interested in the welfare of slaves than in maintaining the natural order. His father, God rest his soul, had been a man of iron will and unquestioned authority. Under his leadership, Willowbrook had been one of the most profitable plantations in Georgia. But since his death, Marjorie had watched their reputation slowly erode as word spread about Thomas's softness. She'd tried everything, sending him to military school. He'd been expelled for refusing to participate in hazing rituals, arranging meetings with suitable young ladies from prominent families. He'd shown no interest whatsoever, even bringing in a tutor to teach him the finer points of slave management. He'd dismissed the man after a week, claiming his methods were unnecessarily harsh. Nothing had worked. If anything, Thomas seemed to be growing more rebellious with age, more determined to reject everything the Lorne family stood for. But today would be different. Today, she would force him to confront his own weakness and overcome it. She would make him fight, make him dominate, make him understand that in their world there was no room for compassion or doubt. The new slaves would serve as perfect opponents. They were tired from their journey, disoriented, and unlikely to seriously harm her son. But the act of fighting them, of asserting his dominance over them, would transform him. It had to. Minutes later, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his slight frame silhouetted against the hallway light. He was undeniably handsome, with soft brown hair that caught the light and gentle blue eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. His clothes were impeccable, a white linen shirt, dark trousers, and polished boots that had never seen a day's real work. But to his mother, these features only emphasized his weakness, his failure to live up to the Lorne name. "You sent for me, Mother." His voice was quiet, cultured, the product of expensive tutoring and careful breeding. There was a tremor in it that spoke of anxiety, of a young man who had learned to fear his mother's summons. "Yes, come here." She didn't turn from the window, forcing him to approach her like a supplicant seeking an audience. Thomas approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture that had become habitual whenever he faced his mother's scrutiny. He could feel the familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times before when called to account for some perceived failure or weakness. "Look out there," Marjorie commanded, pointing toward the slave quarters with a jeweled finger. "What do you see?" Thomas followed her gaze, his heart sinking as he recognized the scene. New arrivals meant new suffering, new lives torn from whatever semblance of family or home they might have known. He could see them huddled together, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Some were barely more than children, others bore the scars of previous hardships. All of them looked lost, displaced, reduced to nothing more than investments in his mother's ledger. "I see people, Mother, people who are afraid." The slap came so quickly that Thomas barely saw it coming. His cheek burned as his mother's hand connected with his face, the sound echoing through the parlor like a gunshot. The force of it sent him stumbling backward, his hand instinctively rising to touch the stinging flesh. "You see property," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You see investments. You see the foundation upon which this family's wealth is built, and it's time you learned to command respect from them." Thomas touched his stinging cheek, his eyes filling with tears he dared not shed. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional wound of his mother's constant disappointment. "Mother, I don't understand." "Of course you don't, because you've spent your life hiding behind books and poetry instead of learning to be a man." She began pacing, her black skirts rustling with each sharp step, like the wings of some predatory bird. For your father would be ashamed of what you've become, a weak, sniveling creature who can't even look a field hand in the eye without seeing some imaginary humanity that doesn't exist. The words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Thomas had loved his father deeply, and the man's death had left a void that his mother seemed determined to fill with cruelty and disappointment. He remembered his father as a stern but fair man, someone who commanded respect through strength rather than fear. But in his mother's version of events, that strength had been built on the complete subjugation of others. "But that ends today," Marjorie continued, her voice rising with each word. "You're going to go down to those quarters, and you're going to fight every one of those new slaves, one by one, until you prove to me and to them that you're worthy of the Lorne name." The news of the impending spectacle spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and meaningful glances. By the time the sun had fully set, every soul on Willowbrook Plantation knew what was to come. In the flickering light of oil lamps and candles, hushed conversations filled the cramped cabins as families huddled together, trying to make sense of their mistress's latest cruelty. The quarters themselves were a stark contrast to the grandeur of the big house. Rows of simple wooden cabins, each housing multiple families, stretched across a cleared area behind the main plantation buildings. The structures were functional, but sparse. Dirt floors, single rooms with rough-hewn furniture, and windows that were little more than openings covered with wooden shutters. The smell of cooking fires and unwashed bodies mingled with the ever-present scent of cotton and earth, creating an atmosphere that spoke of lives lived in the margins of comfort. In the largest cabin, which served as a communal gathering space for meetings and celebrations, the 15 new arrivals sat in a circle on rough wooden benches and makeshift stools. Their chains had been removed upon arrival, but the invisible bonds of their enslavement remained as strong as ever. They were a diverse group, some barely out of their teens, others seasoned by years of bondage. Each carried the weight of their own story, their own losses, their own fears about what lay ahead in this new place that would now define their existence. Among them sat Elias, the man Marjorie had noticed earlier. At 28, he possessed a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from deep within. His dark skin bore the scars of previous hardships, a raised welt across his left shoulder from an overseer's whip, calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor, and a small scar above his right eyebrow from some long-ago accident. But his eyes held something that captivity hadn't been able to touch, a sense of dignity that remained unbroken despite everything he'd endured. There was an intelligence there, too, a sharpness that suggested education, though how he'd acquired it was a mystery that would unfold in time. "They say the young master's gonna fight us," whispered Jacob, a teenager whose hands still bore the calluses of his previous work in the rice fields of South Carolina. His voice cracked with nervousness, and his eyes darted constantly toward the door as if expecting trouble to walk through at any moment. "All of us, one by one, like we're some kind of entertainment." "Ain't no fight," muttered Sarah, an older woman whose grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun secured with a strip of cloth. Her weathered face spoke of decades of hardship, but her eyes remained sharp and knowing. She'd seen enough plantation owners and their children to recognize the type. That boy couldn't fight his way out of a wet sack. This is just his mama's way of trying to make him into something he ain't. Around the circle, other voices joined the conversation. There was Marcus, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, who'd quickly become the informal leader of their group during the journey from Charleston. His presence was commanding, and the others naturally looked to him for guidance in uncertain situations. Beside him sat Ruth, a young woman with intelligent eyes who'd been separated from her children during the sale, a loss that had left her hollow-eyed and withdrawn. There was old Benjamin, whose white hair and stooped shoulders spoke of a lifetime of labor, but whose mind remained sharp as a razor, and there were others, each with their own story of loss and survival. Elias listened to the conversations swirling around him, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd heard about Thomas Lorne during the journey from Charleston, whispered stories from other slaves about the plantation owner's son who was different, who treated the enslaved people with a kindness that was rare among their class. Some called it weakness, others saw it as something more precious. The stories painted a picture of a young man caught between the expectations of his world and the promptings of his conscience. "What you think, Elias?" asked Marcus, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "You've been quiet since we got here. You always got something wise to say." All eyes turned to Elias, and he felt the weight of their expectation. During their journey, he'd emerged as something of a philosopher among them, someone who could find meaning in their suffering and hope in their despair. It was a role he'd never asked for, but one that seemed to come naturally to him. Elias looked up, his gaze steady and thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated cadence that marked him as different from many of his fellow slaves, a mystery that some attributed to a previous owner who'd allowed him to learn to read, though the truth was more complicated than that. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that tomorrow we'll see what kind of man young Master Thomas really is, and maybe he'll see what kind of men we are too." "You talk like you got some plan," Sarah observed, her sharp eyes studying Elias with interest. She'd lived long enough to recognize when someone was thinking several steps ahead. "No plan," Elias replied, shaking his head slowly. "Just understanding. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be what others expect you to be." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around the circle, faces showed varying degrees of comprehension. Some nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning. Others looked confused or frightened by the suggestion of any kind of resistance, however passive. "That kind of thinking can get a man killed," warned Benjamin, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "I've seen too many good folks get themselves hurt, trying to be more than what the white folks want them to be. And I've seen too many good folks lose themselves by being exactly what the white folks want them to be," Elias replied gently. "Sometimes survival isn't just about keeping your body alive. Sometimes it's about keeping your soul alive, too." Meanwhile, in the big house, Thomas sat alone in his room, staring out the window at the slave quarters below. His room was a study in contradictions, expensive furniture and fine fabrics mixed with books of poetry and philosophy that his mother disapproved of. The walls were lined with volumes by authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, writers whose ideas about human dignity and individual conscience had shaped his thinking in ways his mother would find horrifying. He could see the warm glow of lights in the cabins and wondered what the people there were thinking, what they were feeling. The thought of having to fight them, to participate in his mother's twisted theater of dominance, made him physically ill. His hands shook as he tried to read, the words blurring together on the page as his mind raced with anxiety and dread. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting to see one of the house servants. Instead, his mother entered, carrying a tray with his dinner. This was unusual. Marjorie rarely performed such domestic tasks herself, preferring to maintain the distance that her position required. The tray held his favorite foods, roasted chicken, fresh bread, and sweet tea, but the sight of it only made his stomach churn with nervousness. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on his writing desk with careful precision. "You'll need your strength for tomorrow." Thomas looked at the food, but felt no appetite. The very thought of eating while contemplating what lay ahead seemed obscene. "Mother, please, there must be another way." "There is no other way," she interrupted, her voice softer than it had been earlier, but no less firm. She moved to his bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of volumes she considered dangerous influences. "Thomas, do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I want to see my son humiliated?" He looked up at her, surprised by the almost gentle tone. For a moment she looked less like the iron-willed plantation mistress and more like a mother concerned for her child. "Then why?" "Because the world is cruel and it will destroy you if you don't learn to be stronger than it is." She sat on the edge of his bed, her posture uncharacteristically relaxed. The black silk of her dress rustled softly as she settled herself, and for a moment Thomas caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been before years of managing a plantation had hardened her heart. "Your father understood this. He knew that kindness without strength is just weakness in disguise." "Father was never cruel," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. No, he wasn't. But he was strong. He commanded respect without having to demand it, and that's what you need to learn. She reached out and touched his cheek where she'd slapped him earlier, her fingers surprisingly gentle. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Thomas. I'm doing it to save you. For a moment, Thomas saw something in his mother's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Genuine concern, perhaps even love. But it was a love twisted by fear and desperation, a love that sought to protect by destroying the very thing it claimed to cherish. It was quickly replaced by the familiar steel of determination. Get some rest, she said, rising from the bed with the fluid grace that had made her a belle in her youth. Tomorrow you become the man you were born to be. After she left, Thomas lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. He thought about his father, about the stories he'd heard of the man's fairness and strength. He thought about the slaves in the quarters below, about their fear and uncertainty. And he thought about himself, about who he was and who he was expected to become. As the night deepened, a plan began to form in his mind. Not a plan for victory in the traditional sense, but something else entirely. Something that might honor both his father's memory and his own conscience. He'd spent years reading about civil disobedience and moral resistance, about men who'd chosen to follow their conscience rather than the expectations of society. Perhaps tomorrow would be his chance to put those principles into practice. In the slave quarters, Elias lay on his thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into sleep. The night was filled with the usual sounds, crickets chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft murmur of conversations from neighboring cabins. But underneath it all was a tension, an anticipation of what tomorrow would bring. He thought about his own father, a free man who'd been kidnapped and sold into slavery when Elias was just a child. That man had taught him to read in secret, sharing books smuggled from sympathetic abolitionists, and teaching him that education was the one thing that could never be taken away. He thought about the lessons that man had taught him about dignity, about the difference between being broken and being bent. Tomorrow would bring a test for all of them, not just of physical strength but of character. And Elias had a feeling that the young master they were meant to fight might surprise everyone, including himself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. But neither Thomas nor Elias could have predicted the form that change would take, or the courage it would require from both of them. Dawn broke grey and humid over Willowbrook Plantation, the air thick with the promise of another scorching Georgia day. The morning mist clung to the cotton fields like ghostly fingers, and the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees dripped with dew that would soon evaporate under the relentless sun. By 7 o'clock, word had spread to every corner of the property. The spectacle would begin at 9, in the open area between the slave quarters and the cotton gin house. The chosen location was significant, a patch of hard-packed earth where cotton bales were normally loaded onto wagons, now transformed into an arena for Marjorie's twisted theatre. It was visible from both the big house and the slave quarters, ensuring that everyone would have a clear view of what was intended to be Thomas's transformation from boy to man. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was where the fruits of slave labor were processed and shipped away, and now it would be where the heir to the plantation would supposedly learn to dominate those whose labor made his wealth possible. Thomas stood before his mirror, his hands shaking as he attempted to button his shirt. The face looking back at him was pale and drawn, dark circles under his blue eyes, testament to a sleepless night spent wrestling with his conscience. He'd barely slept, his mind racing through scenarios, each more humiliating than the last. The face looking back at him was pale and drawn, his blue eyes reflecting a fear that went deeper than physical pain. This wasn't just about fighting, it was about becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone he didn't want to be. His room, usually a sanctuary filled with books and quiet contemplation, now felt like a prison cell. The volumes of poetry and philosophy that lined his shelves seemed to mock him with their ideals of human dignity and moral courage. How could he reconcile the principles he'd read about with the reality of what his mother was forcing him to do? How could he maintain his integrity while participating in a spectacle designed to dehumanize others? A knock at his door made him jump, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. "Master Thomas?" It was Bessie, one of the house servants who'd helped raise him. Her voice carried a note of sympathy that almost brought tears to his eyes. "Your mama says it's time." "Thank you, Bessie," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He could hear the pity in her tone, and it made his shame burn even hotter. As he walked through the halls of the house he'd grown up in, Thomas felt like he was moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The familiar portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him with disapproving eyes, their painted faces stern with the weight of family expectations. These were men who'd built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved people, who'd never questioned the system that had made them wealthy. What would they think of their descendants' reluctance to embrace that legacy? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times as he reached the front door, each toll sounding like a death knell. Through the windows he could see the crowd already gathered in the makeshift arena. A sea of faces turned expectantly toward the house. His mother stood on the raised porch of the overseer's house, positioned like a queen surveying her domain. Outside, the entire population of Willowbrook Plantation had gathered. Nearly 200 enslaved people stood in a loose semicircle, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and resignation. They'd seen spectacles before, punishments, demonstrations of power, reminders of their place in the world. Public whippings, brandings, and worse had all taken place in this same area. But this felt different, more personal somehow. The young master they'd watched grow up was about to be forced into a role that many of them could see he was unsuited for. Among the crowd were faces Thomas recognized, house servants who'd cared for him as a child, field hands who'd tipped their hats respectfully when he passed, craftsmen who'd taught him small skills when his mother wasn't watching. Their expressions ranged from sympathy to fear to a kind of resigned sadness. They understood what this spectacle was really about, not just Thomas's transformation, but a reinforcement of the power structure that kept them all in chains. Marjorie stood on the raised porch of the overseer's house, positioned to have the best view of the proceedings. She wore her finest black dress, as if this were a formal occasion worthy of ceremony. The fabric was silk imported from France, adorned with jet beads that caught the morning light. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her personal maid an hour to complete. Every detail of her appearance was calculated to project authority and control. Samuel stood beside her, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the day's events, but too loyal or too afraid to object. His weathered hands fidgeted with his hat. Hand sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the relatively cool morning air. He'd been with the Lawn family long enough to know that questioning Marjorie's decisions was a dangerous proposition, but something about this felt wrong, even by the standards of plantation life. The 15 new slaves were arranged in a line, their faces carefully neutral. They'd learned long ago that showing emotion during such displays could lead to additional punishment. But beneath their stoic exteriors, each man was calculating, planning, trying to understand what was expected of them and how to survive it. They'd been given no instructions beyond the basic command to fight when called upon, leaving them to guess at the rules of this strange game. Elias stood third from the left, his posture straight and dignified despite the circumstances. Unlike some of the others, who kept their eyes downcast, he allowed his gaze to meet Thomas's as the young man approached. What he saw there surprised him. Instead of the arrogance or cruelty he might have expected from a plantation owner's son, he saw fear, shame, and something else, a deep sadness that seemed to mirror his own. There was something in Thomas's eyes that spoke of a soul in torment, of a young man being forced to betray his own nature. Elias had seen that look before, in the faces of people who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point. It was the look of someone who was about to make a choice that would define the rest of their life. "Thomas," Marjorie called out, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. The morning air was still, with no breeze to carry away her words, ensuring that every person present could hear her clearly. "You will fight each of these men in turn. The rules are simple. The fight ends when your opponent can no longer stand or when he submits. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. His throat felt dry as dust, and his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Then begin. Samuel, bring forward the first one." The first man was Jacob, the youngest of the new arrivals. As he stepped forward, Thomas could see the teenager's hands trembling slightly. This wasn't a fair fight by any measure. Jacob was malnourished from the journey, exhausted and clearly terrified. The boy couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds, and his thin frame spoke of years of inadequate nutrition. They faced each other in the center of the makeshift ring, and Thomas felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't combat. It was cruelty, disguised as a lesson. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered as they faced each other, the words barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. Jacob's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected apology, but before he could respond, Samuel called out, "Begin!" What followed was less a fight than a tragic pantomime. Thomas, who had never thrown a punch in anger in his life, swung awkwardly at Jacob, who seemed equally reluctant to engage. They grappled clumsily, more like children playing than men fighting, their movements hesitant and uncertain. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as the two young men stumbled around each other, neither wanting to cause real harm. Finally, Jacob, whether from exhaustion, strategy, or simple mercy, allowed himself to fall and stayed down. He lay on the hard-packed earth, breathing heavily but uninjured, his eyes closed as if in relief that the ordeal was over. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the display of dominance Marjorie had envisioned. Her face flushed with anger and embarrassment as she realized that her carefully planned lesson was becoming a farce. "Again!" she commanded, her voice sharp with displeasure. "Bring the next one." The second fight was similar, awkward, half-hearted, ending with Thomas's opponent yielding more from pity than defeat. The man, a field hand named Moses, who'd been sold away from his family in Virginia, seemed to understand what was really happening and chose to spare the young master further humiliation by going down after only a few half-hearted exchanges. By the third fight, the crowd was growing restless, and Marjorie's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. Her carefully orchestrated demonstration of power was becoming a public humiliation, and she could feel her authority slipping away with each pathetic display. Then it was Elias's turn. As he stepped forward, something shifted in the atmosphere. Unlike the others, Elias moved with confidence, his posture straight and dignified. He was taller than Thomas, broader in the shoulders, and carried himself like a man who had never truly been broken despite everything he'd endured. There was something in his bearing that commanded respect, even in these circumstances. The crowd sensed the difference immediately. Here was a man who wouldn't simply fall down to spare Thomas's feelings. Here was someone who might actually fight back, who might force the young master to confront the reality of what his mother was asking him to do. They faced each other in the center of the makeshift ring, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Thomas looked into Elias's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected: understanding. Not pity, not contempt, but a deep recognition of shared humanity. In that gaze he saw intelligence, compassion, and a strength that had nothing to do with physical power. "I don't want to hurt you," Thomas said quietly, so only Elias could hear. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of genuine anguish. "I know," Elias replied, his voice equally soft but somehow carrying more strength than Thomas had ever heard in his own. "And I don't want to hurt you either." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible divide. In that moment, they weren't master and slave, white and black, free and enslaved. They were simply two human beings recognizing each other's pain and choosing compassion over cruelty. "Begin!" Samuel shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. But instead of raising his fists, Elias did something that would be talked about in whispers for generations to come. He stepped closer to Thomas, close enough that their faces were only inches apart. The crowd held its breath, expecting violence, expecting the clash of bodies and the sound of flesh striking flesh. Instead, Elias raised his hand, slowly, gently, and cupped Thomas's face. The touch was electric, sending shockwaves through both men and through every person watching. It was tender, intimate, and utterly forbidden. In that moment, all the rules of their world, the carefully maintained hierarchies of race, class, and power, seemed to crumble like ancient walls finally giving way to time and pressure. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, Not of pain, but of something far more complex. In Elias's touch he felt acceptance, understanding, and something else that he'd never experienced before, the possibility of being truly seen and valued for who he was, not who he was expected to be. The gentle pressure of those calloused fingers against his cheek was like a benediction, a blessing he'd never known he needed. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Thomas's shaky breathing and the distant call of a mockingbird in the oak trees. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Marjorie seemed frozen, her mouth slightly open in shock at this unprecedented breach of every social convention she held sacred. Then Elias spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd. "I won't fight you, young master. Not because I'm afraid, but because I see who you really are, and that person doesn't deserve to be hurt." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the plantation system represented. Here was a slave, property according to the law, asserting his own moral authority, refusing to participate in his own dehumanization. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Thomas's ragged breathing and the distant rustle of leaves in the ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of cruelty and oppression. Thomas felt something break open inside his chest, a dam of emotion that had been building for years. Without thinking, without caring about the consequences, he leaned into Elias's touch, his eyes closing as he experienced, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be truly accepted. The gentle pressure of those work-hardened fingers against his skin was like a revelation, showing him a tenderness he'd never known existed. The moment lasted only seconds, but its impact would reverberate through the plantation for months to come. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, he saw his mother's face contorted with rage and something else, fear. Fear of what this moment represented, of what it might mean for her carefully controlled world. Around them, the crowd of enslaved people watched with a mixture of awe and terror. They understood the significance of what they were witnessing better than anyone. This wasn't just a refusal to fight. It was a declaration of humanity, a rejection of the very foundations upon which their oppression was built. Some faces showed hope, others fear of the retribution that was sure to follow. "Enough!" Marjorie's voice cracked like a whip across the silence, shattering the spell that had fallen over the gathering. Her face was flushed with fury, her carefully arranged hair beginning to come undone in her agitation. "Samuel, take that slave to the punishment post. 20 lashes for his insolence." The command sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. 20 lashes could kill a man or leave him permanently damaged. It was a punishment reserved for the most serious offenses, escape attempts, violence against whites, or open rebellion. The fact that Marjorie was ordering it for an act of gentleness spoke volumes about how threatened she felt by what had just occurred. But as Samuel moved forward, his face grim with reluctance, Thomas stepped between him and Elias. For the first time in his life, his voice rang out strong and clear, carrying an authority that surprised everyone present, including himself. "No. There will be no punishment. This man has done nothing wrong." The confrontation between mother and son played out before the entire plantation like a Greek tragedy, with 200 witnesses to what would become the most talked-about moment in Willowbrook's history. The very air seemed to crackle with tension as two worldviews collided in the most public way possible. "Step aside, Thomas," Marjorie commanded, her voice deadly quiet but carrying an undertone of barely controlled rage. "You're making a spectacle of yourself." "No, Mother." Thomas's voice was steady now, strengthened by the warmth of Elias's hand, still resting gently on his face. "The spectacle is over." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Never had anyone seen the young master defy his mother so directly, so publicly. The enslaved people who'd known him since childhood watched in amazement as the gentle boy they'd helped raise found his voice at last. Samuel stood frozen, caught between conflicting orders from the two people who controlled his fate. His weathered face showed the strain of a man trying to navigate an impossible situation. He'd been loyal to the Lawn family for 15 years, but he'd never faced anything like this. Marjorie descended from the porch like an avenging angel, her black dress billowing behind her like storm clouds. Her face was a mask of fury, but underneath it, Thomas could see something else: desperation. This wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about maintaining her very identity as the unquestioned ruler of her domain. "You will move, or I will have you both whipped," she declared, her voice rising to carry across the entire gathering. "Then you'll have to whip me too," came a voice from the crowd. It was Sarah, the older woman who'd spoken in the quarters the night before. She stepped forward, her grey head held high despite the danger she was courting. "Because I ain't gonna stand by and watch you punish a man for showing kindness." The words sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. For a slave to speak out during such a confrontation was unheard of, potentially fatal. But Sarah's courage seemed to unlock something in the others. "Nor will I," said Marcus, moving to stand beside Sarah. His broad shoulders and commanding presence made his defiance even more significant. One by one, other slaves began to step forward, first the new arrivals, then some of the long-time residents of Willowbrook. Not all of them, for fear was a powerful force, but enough to make it clear that something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance of power that had maintained order on the plantation for generations was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Among those who stepped forward was old Benjamin, whose white hair and stooped shoulders spoke of decades of servitude. His presence lent weight to the growing rebellion, as he was respected by both the enslaved community and the white overseers. There was Ruth, the young woman who'd been separated from her children, her face set with a determination born of having nothing left to lose. Even some of the house servants, who typically maintained more distance from field hands, began to edge forward. Marjorie looked around at the faces surrounding her, and for the first time in years she felt her absolute authority wavering. The careful system of control she'd maintained through fear and intimidation was dissolving before her eyes. "You're all making a terrible mistake," she said, but her voice lacked its usual commanding power. Thomas finally turned away from Elias to face his mother directly, his hand still tingling from the gentle touch that had changed everything. "The mistake was mine, Mother. I've spent my whole life trying to be someone I'm not, trying to earn your approval by denying who I really am, but I can't do it anymore." "And who are you, Thomas?" Marjorie's voice dripped with disdain, but underneath it was a note of genuine desperation. A weak, perverted boy who would rather consort with slaves than take his rightful place as master of this plantation. The words were meant to wound, to drive Thomas back into submission through shame and humiliation. They were calculated to strike at his deepest insecurities, to remind him of all the ways he'd failed to meet her expectations. But instead of crumbling, Thomas stood straighter. "I'm someone who believes that every person in this place, slave or free, black or white, deserves to be treated with dignity. I'm someone who thinks strength comes from protecting others, not from dominating them. And yes, Mother, I'm someone who could love a man like Elias, if the world would let me." The admission sent shockwaves through the crowd. In 1858, Georgia, such words were not just scandalous, they were dangerous. The very concept of love between men was so taboo that it was rarely even spoken of, let alone declared publicly. But Thomas had passed the point of caring about danger. The enslaved people in the crowd reacted with a mixture of surprise and understanding. Many of them had suspected something different about the young master, had seen the way he looked at certain men, the way he seemed uncomfortable around the young ladies his mother paraded before him. But to hear him speak it aloud, to claim it as part of his identity, was both shocking and strangely liberating. Elias, who had remained silent through the exchange, finally spoke. His voice carried across the gathering with a dignity that commanded attention. "Mrs. Lorne, your son has more courage in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. You should be proud of him." "Proud?" Marjorie laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound that held no trace of humor. "Proud of a son who would throw away everything his family has built for the sake of, what? Some twisted infatuation with a slave?" "For the sake of love," Thomas said simply, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him, "and for the sake of doing what's right." The word love hung in the air between them, and Marjorie felt something cold settle in her chest. She had always known, on some level, that her son was different. But she had convinced herself that with enough pressure, enough discipline, she could force him to conform to her expectations. The realization that she had not only failed but had driven him to this public rebellion was almost too much to bear. "Samuel," she said, her voice regaining some of its authority through sheer force of will, "clear this crowd. Send everyone back to their quarters. And lock that slave," she pointed at Elias with a trembling finger, "in the punishment shed until I decide what to do with him." But Samuel hesitated, looking around at the faces surrounding him. These were people he'd worked alongside for years, people whose children he'd watched grow up, people who'd shown him respect even when they had no reason to. The idea of forcing them to disperse at gunpoint, for that's what it would take, suddenly seemed not just wrong, but impossible. "Mrs. Lorne," he said carefully, his voice heavy with the weight of years of loyalty now being tested, "maybe we should think about this. The work still needs to be done, and if we start punishing folks for standing together—" "Are you defying me too, Samuel?" Marjorie's voice rose to a near shriek, the carefully maintained facade of control finally cracking completely. "No, ma'am. I'm just thinking about what's best for the plantation." Samuel's words were measured, but there was a new note in his voice, a suggestion that his loyalty might have limits after all. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and the crowd of people who had risked everything to support him. "What's best for the plantation is treating people like human beings instead of property. What's best is ending this system that turns us all into monsters." "You naive fool," Marjorie spat, her composure completely shattered now. "Do you think you can just declare slavery over and everything will be fine? Do you think the other planters will stand for it? The state government, you'll lose everything, the land, the house, the family name. Everything your father worked for will be gone." "Then so be it," Thomas replied without hesitation. "I'd rather lose everything than keep it through the suffering of others." As the standoff continued, Elias quietly moved closer to Thomas, his presence a steadying force in the chaos. "Whatever happens," he murmured, his voice meant only for Thomas's ears, "you've already changed things. You've shown everyone here that another way is possible." The words gave Thomas strength, reminding him that this moment was about more than just his own rebellion. It was about the possibility of transformation, of breaking cycles of oppression that had seemed unbreakable just moments before. Marjorie heard the exchange and felt her last vestige of control slipping away. In desperation, she played her final card, the threat she'd been holding in reserve. "Fine," she said, her voice cold as winter frost. "If this is the choice you're making, Thomas, then you're no longer my son. You're no longer a Lorne. Samuel, prepare the papers to disinherit him. He can leave this plantation with nothing but the clothes on his back." The threat that had terrified Thomas just days before now seemed almost laughably empty. The fear of losing his inheritance, his name, his place in society, all of it paled in comparison to the possibility of living with integrity. "I accept," he said without hesitation. "I'd rather be a free man with nothing than a slave owner with everything." As the implications of his words sank in, murmurs began to spread through the crowd. Some of the enslaved people looked hopeful, others fearful of what changes might come. The house servants, who had known Thomas since childhood, began to weep. Some from sorrow at seeing the family torn apart, others from pride at seeing the boy they'd helped raise finally stand up for what was right. Marjorie stood alone now, isolated by her own rigidity and cruelty. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, her son, the slaves, even her overseer, and saw that she had lost them all. The empire she'd built through fear and intimidation was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There are laws. There are other planters who won't stand for this kind of revolution." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was facing. "But it started here, today. And once something like this begins, it's very hard to stop." As if to prove his point, more slaves began to step forward, forming a protective circle around Thomas and Elias. They weren't just protecting two individuals. They were protecting an idea, a possibility, a glimpse of a world where things could be different. Marjorie, seeing that she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, turned and walked back toward the big house, her spine rigid with fury and defeat. But even as she retreated, she was already planning. There were other ways to fight this, other weapons to use. The law was on her side, and the society around them would never accept what had happened here today. But as Thomas took Elias's hand in full view of everyone present, as the crowd began to disperse with new hope in their hearts, it was clear that something irreversible had occurred. The old order was cracking, and through those cracks, light was beginning to shine. The sun was setting over Willowbrook Plantation, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. And for the first time in the plantation's history, that sunset felt like the promise of a new dawn rather than the end of another day of suffering. Thomas and Elias stood together, their hands intertwined, facing an uncertain future, but no longer facing it alone. Around them, the people of Willowbrook began to imagine, perhaps for the first time, what freedom might actually look like. The fire had been lit, and it would not be easily extinguished. 6 months later, Willowbrook Plantation was a very different place, though the transformation had come at a tremendous cost. The legal battles had been fierce and unrelenting. Marjorie had indeed tried to use every weapon at her disposal to maintain her control, bringing in magistrates and neighboring planters to support her cause. She'd filed lawsuits challenging Thomas's right to make decisions about the plantation, claiming he was mentally unfit and had been unduly influenced by outside agitators. The local newspapers had picked up the story, painting Thomas as either a dangerous radical or a tragic victim of northern propaganda, depending on their political leanings. But Thomas, with the help of sympathetic abolitionists from Atlanta and Savannah, had found ways to gradually transition the plantation toward a system of paid labor. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. The legal framework for such a transition barely existed in Georgia, and every step had to be carefully negotiated to avoid running afoul of state laws that still recognized slavery as legal and protected property rights in human beings. Many of the former slaves chose to leave, seeking family members sold away years before, or simply wanting to start fresh somewhere new, away from the memories of bondage. The partings were often tearful, as bonds had formed between people who'd shared the worst of times together. Sarah, the elderly woman who'd first spoken up in Thomas's defense, chose to head north to Philadelphia, where she had a sister who'd escaped years earlier. Marcus decided to try his luck in the growing city of Atlanta, where his skills as a carpenter might earn him a decent living. Others stayed, drawn by the promise of fair wages and the chance to work land they'd always tended but never owned. Thomas had divided much of the plantation into smaller plots, offering long-term leases to families who wanted to try their hand at independent farming. It was a radical experiment that drew criticism from neighboring planters and suspicion from some of the former slaves themselves, who found it hard to believe that any white man could be trusted to keep such promises. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Some of the neighboring planters, feeling threatened by the example Willowbrook represented, had organized boycotts of Thomas's cotton and other crops. Banks that had previously been eager to do business with the Lawn family suddenly found reasons to deny credit. There were threats of violence, both subtle and overt, and more than once Thomas had to sleep with a loaded rifle by his bed. Thomas and Elias had faced their own unique challenges as their relationship deepened. Their love, while accepted by many on the plantation, was still dangerous in the broader world of antebellum Georgia. They lived quietly, carefully, finding joy in small moments and strength in their shared commitment to building something better. They'd converted one of the smaller outbuildings into a private residence, creating a space where they could be themselves away from prying eyes. Elias had revealed more of his remarkable story during those months. He'd been born free in Charleston, the son of a successful blacksmith who'd managed to purchase his own freedom and that of his wife. Elias had been educated by Quaker missionaries and had been working as a teacher in a school for free blacks when he'd been kidnapped by slave catchers who'd forged papers claiming he was a runaway. His education and natural intelligence had made him a valuable commodity, but also a dangerous one, as educated slaves were seen as potential leaders of rebellion. Together, Thomas and Elias had established a school in one of the former slave cabins, teaching reading and writing to anyone who wanted to learn. It was technically illegal under Georgia law, but the local authorities seemed reluctant to interfere with what was happening at Willowbrook, perhaps recognizing that the situation was too complex and too volatile to handle with simple enforcement. Marjorie had eventually left Willowbrook, unable to bear the sight of what her son had created. She moved to Savannah, where she spent her remaining years writing bitter letters to newspapers about the corruption of Southern values and the dangerous influence of Northern agitators. She never spoke to Thomas again, taking her anger and disappointment to her grave 3 years later. Her death was a source of both grief and relief for Thomas, who mourned the mother he'd once known while feeling freed from the weight of her constant disapproval. The plantation's transformation had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Journalists from northern newspapers began arriving to document what they called the Willowbrook experiment. Some came expecting to find chaos and failure, only to discover a thriving community where former slaves and poor whites worked side by side with a dignity that had been impossible under the old system. Others came as skeptics and left as converts to the possibility of gradual emancipation. Religious leaders, too, began to take notice. A group of Methodist ministers from Atlanta visited and declared that what was happening at Willowbrook represented Christianity in action, a practical demonstration of the principles of human brotherhood that they preached but rarely saw implemented. This religious endorsement provided Thomas with some protection from his critics, as it became harder to dismiss his actions as mere radicalism when they were being praised from pulpits across the state. But the seeds of change that had been planted that day in the summer of 1858 continued to grow beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook. Other plantations began to hear whispers of what had happened, and while most dismissed it as impossible or dangerous, some began to question their own practices. A few progressive planters, particularly those with sons who'd been educated in northern universities, began experimenting with small reforms, better living conditions for slaves, opportunities for education, even limited forms of compensation for work. The Underground Railroad found new allies in unexpected places. Samuel, the former overseer who'd witnessed Thomas's transformation, had quietly begun providing information about slave patrols and safe routes to conductors helping people escape to freedom. His knowledge of local law enforcement and his relationships with other overseers made him an invaluable asset to the network of people working to undermine slavery from within. The story of Thomas and Elias had spread through the enslaved community across Georgia and beyond, carried by the informal networks of communication that connected plantations throughout the South. It became a source of hope for people who'd never imagined that a white person might choose love over power, justice over profit. Songs began to emerge in the slave quarters, coded spirituals that told the story of the master who chose love and the touch that changed everything. When the Civil War finally came 3 years later, Willowbrook was ready. The plantation had become a safe haven for escaped slaves and a supply depot for Union forces when they finally reached Georgia. Thomas, who had never thought of himself as a soldier, found himself fighting not with weapons, but with conviction, using his knowledge of the local area to help guide others to freedom and providing intelligence to Union commanders about Confederate troop movements. The war years were difficult for everyone at Willowbrook. Food became scarce as supply lines were disrupted, and there was constant fear of Confederate raids seeking to punish what they saw as a nest of traitors and abolitionists. Several times, Thomas and Elias had to hide in the swamps for days while Confederate cavalry searched the plantation for the traitor Lorne and his Negro accomplice. But the community they'd built proved resilient. The bonds forged in those early days of transformation held strong even under the pressures of war. Former slaves who could have fled to Union lines chose instead to stay and defend what they'd helped create. Poor whites who'd found dignity and fair wages at Willowbrook stood alongside their black neighbors when Confederate deserters tried to raid the plantation's supplies. Elias, meanwhile, had become a leader not just at Willowbrook, but in the broader community of former slaves throughout the region. His education and natural charisma made him a powerful speaker, and he traveled throughout Georgia whenever it was safe, helping to establish schools and churches, teaching others to read and write, and serving as a bridge between the old world and the new one they were all trying to build. His speeches, delivered in churches and schoolhouses across the state, became legendary for their combination of intellectual rigor and emotional power. He spoke of dignity and self-determination, of the importance of education and economic independence, and of the possibility of a South where all people could live together in equality and mutual respect. His words inspired a generation of formerly enslaved people to believe that they could be more than just free, they could be truly equal. The love that had begun with a gentle touch in a moment of defiance had grown into something larger and more powerful than either Thomas or Elias could have imagined. It had become a love for justice, for human dignity, for the possibility that people could change and that systems of oppression could be dismantled, one heart at a time. Their personal relationship, while still requiring discretion in public, had become a symbol of the broader transformation that was possible when people chose courage over comfort. As the war drew to a close and emancipation became the law of the land, Willowbrook found itself at the forefront of reconstruction efforts in Georgia. The community that Thomas and Elias had built became a model for others trying to navigate the transition from slavery to freedom. Delegations of politicians, educators, and social reformers came to study what they'd accomplished, hoping to replicate it elsewhere. The challenges of Reconstruction brought new tests for the Willowbrook community. The end of slavery didn't end racism, and the backlash against black freedom was swift and violent. The Ku Klux Klan emerged as a terrorist organization dedicated to maintaining white supremacy through intimidation and violence, and Willowbrook, with its integrated community and successful black farmers, became a target. There were night raids and burned crops, threatening letters and economic boycotts. Several times, Thomas and Elias had to organize the community's defense against groups of masked riders who came to terrorize black families and punish white race traitors. The school they'd established was burned down twice, only to be rebuilt each time with even greater determination. But the community endured, strengthened by the bonds that had been forged in those early days of transformation. The children who'd learned to read in their school grew up to become teachers, ministers, and business owners. The farmers who'd been given their first chance at land ownership became prosperous enough to help others get their start. The example of what was possible at Willowbrook continued to inspire others throughout the South and beyond. Years later, when historians would write about the causes of the Civil War and the end of slavery, they would focus on the big names, the famous battles, the political maneuvering in Washington. But those who lived through it knew that change often began in smaller moments, in the courage of individuals who chose love over fear, compassion over cruelty, and hope over despair. The story of Thomas and Elias became legend in their part of Georgia, passed down through generations as proof that even in the darkest times, even in the most oppressive systems, the human capacity for love and transformation could not be completely extinguished. Their names were spoken with reverence in black churches and whispered with admiration in the quarters of plantations where people still dreamed of freedom. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blew through the oak trees that still stood on what had once been Willowbrook Plantation, old-timers swore they could still feel the echo of that moment when everything changed, when a gentle touch broke through centuries of hatred and showed the world that another way was possible. The fire that had been lit that day burned on, carried forward by everyone who chose to believe that love was stronger than fear, that justice was worth fighting for, and that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be transformed by the courage of individuals willing to stand up and say, "This is not who we have to be." In the end, the true victory wasn't in the battles won or the laws changed, but in the hearts transformed and the lives touched by the simple truth that love, in all its forms, was more powerful than hate. The forbidden touch that had shocked a plantation and challenged a system had become a beacon of hope that continued to shine long after those who'd witnessed it had passed into memory. The legacy of Willowbrook lived on in the schools established by its former residents, in the churches where they preached equality and justice, in the businesses they built and the families they raised. It lived on in every act of courage, every choice of love over fear, every moment when someone decided to see the humanity in another person, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. And in the quiet moments, when Thomas and Elias sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the Georgia sky in brilliant colors, they knew that they had been part of something larger than themselves, a movement toward justice that would continue long after they were gone, carried forward by all those who believed that a better world was possible. What did you think of this incredible story of courage and forbidden love? Stories like this remind us that change often begins with a single act of bravery, a moment when someone chooses love over fear. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more powerful historical narratives that will leave you thinking long after the video ends. Tell us in the comments, what moment in history do you think shows the power of love to overcome oppression? We'd love to hear your thoughts.